So I've got the task of following several of my former colleagues who have probably told you things that I should have known or may have known. So I'm going to try to do something that follows up on them. One of them, of course, is Jason Long, who talked a lot about economic growth. And he and I studied under some of the same people, think some of the same sorts of ways about that. Of course, the thing that we think a lot about is what we call sustained economic growth. And for economic historians, the beginnings of sustained growth is just this dramatic event. And I know Jason talked about that and gave you a lot of a good picture of how that happened. But remember, for most of history, most of the world was quite poor. Now, I didn't mean there weren't pockets of wealth, but there were just no countries with sustained economic growth. I don't know if I'm going to contradict Jason here or not, but I would say the dates are between 1750 and 1820. Economic historians love to argue about little sorts of things, and so we argue about exactly when it happened. I don't think it's a worry here to try to figure out the exact sort of a date. And of course, this I think is recapitulating the things that Jason told you. It happens in England and the Netherlands, then it happens in North America, happens in other countries in Europe, and then it happens in other parts of the world. And in fact, he may have actually used this exact graph. I don't know, is this one of yours, the Gregory Clark graph? Okay, I'll use it again. This is per capita income in the world from about 1000 BC. It just moves along. That constant line is actually per capita income in England in 1800, and it's trying to get it up off the vertical axis or the horizontal axis so we can see it. Notice there's some ups and downs, and if you cut into that, you will find places, the Greek city-states, parts of the Roman Empire, where there's a little bit of growth for a period of time, and certainly some people in those societies that become very wealthy. I mean, you can look around at some of the Taj Mahal and other great civilizations, architecture, and but there's not much is really happening in terms of economic growth. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing happening in the world during that period of time. Great literature, music, architecture, a lot of things come out of this. So it's not as if this is just, a world of complete stagnation. But in terms of economic growth, not much is happening. And then, of course, we get this huge turning point. That's just something that, economists, economic historians look at that, and we think that is something we ought to think a lot about. And they have thought a lot about it, and it's the sort of a thing that Jason and I think a lot about. Clark gives us a label for these periods. The first one he calls the Malthusian trap. That's named after Thomas Malthus, a British clergyman, who argued that economies you will never get substantial increases in human well-being measured in a material level, because whenever you get increases in production, population will rise, will increase enough to use that up. Malthus was a very insightful person writing around 1820, and he was right, describing the period before, very wrong describing what took place afterwards. Clark calls this the Industrial Revolution. I think a better term is the institutional revolution. It is industrial revolution driven by technological changes. The question is why the technological changes that occurred, particularly in England, and why not other places? And part of that answer goes to the particular institutions. And then Clark divides it and calls this the Great Divergence. And that is one of the interesting things and one of the troubling sorts of things. We've had substantial increases in per capita income in the world, but it has not happened everywhere. And so he divides it into two groups. And I think maybe Jason has done the same thing. We've modified his graph a little bit here. There's on this tail right in there. Clark has it actually going down. I think it goes up a little bit. Most of the parts of the world since 1800 have experienced at least a little bit of growth. But the big thing is this huge gap. And it's a gap that we as Christians ought to think a lot about. It's something that, and I think, that those of us who happen to live or spend a lot of our time in what we would call the developed part of the world should think seriously about where we are and think seriously about the fact that I don't think it's any great moral worthiness of our part that we ended up in that sort of a situation. We are fortunate, and also some complex sorts of challenges that Seth talked about in that sort of a world. So this is what Jason talked about. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that, but I want to kind of go behind that and ask, what's going on? And we have an interesting period of time. We have the 20th century. In a sense, you could say that the 20th century is this huge social experiment, if you will, and driven by different ways of thinking about how the world is organized. So in the 20th century, it starts in the 19th century in a few places, but then it gradually moves to other places in the world. And so in the 20th century, you have a lot of economies that are using what we would call market coordination mechanisms, but you get some competing ways of doing it. There's at one point about a third of the world is under what we would call command economies. After 1917, it's the Russian Revolution. After 1945, then a lot of Eastern Europe. You get Cuba, you get China, that are trying to use kind of a centrally coordinated sort of a system. And so in some ways, if you wanted to design an experiment that goes across time and space, you can look at the 20th century as an experiment, as a costly in some ways, but just sort of natural experiment in terms of which we say, well, how do we coordinate human activity? How do people cooperate to do certain sorts of things? And as you're probably aware, market economies won the battle in a material sense. Now we want to talk about some of the other sorts of things, and Seth was giving us some insights into both the pluses and the minuses in terms of market economies. But if you look at the 20th century, it is a period of time in which generally lots of different forms of market coordination, but that there's very few places in the world today that are committed to the alternative of a strong command economy, and North Korea and Cuba would be the two that we would still put into that sort of a category. So and of course during this century, China moves towards markets. Now they do it without, they would claim, without an ideological revolution. They would still claim it's at least for a period of time. They said this is socialism with a human face, or as Deng Xiaoping said when he came to power, we're going to try a lot of things, and the things that work we're going to call socialism, and the things that don't work we're going to call capitalism. So, so he kept his socialist credentials by doing that, and of course we get the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. I'm old enough that I taught a course called Comparative Economic Systems for some 35 years, and I must say that almost none of the authors that are the field of comparative systems predicted the fall of the major command economies. It was almost a complete surprise. We talked about some of the difficulties within those sorts of systems, but there were very, very few people that were saying the system will not sustain itself. But it didn't. So we get those sorts of reforms. China starts reforming in the late 70s and goes through fairly substantial sorts of reforms. Still is not a democracy on the questions that Seth was raising, but has many more market-oriented sorts of policies. Countries like India that start out, once they gain independence, with a pretty much what you'd call a planned economy. You might call it democratic socialism because they've been a democracy, but then they enact pretty substantial market reforms in 1991. Still lots of questions about how well are they going to do. They just elected a new prime minister, and the argument is, will he be able to put in kind of more market sorts of reforms? Well, you've had a lot of things about what I would call the evidence. I want to go back and say why. You know, if we look at the 20th century, why is it that these economies that coordinate around what we would call private property and prices, and that's the fundamental coordination mechanism for commercial activity. It's not the fundamental coordination mechanism for all of life. If it were the coordination mechanism for all of life, it would be a pretty barren place. If everything were priced and there were property rights that were being exchanged, there should be a whole lot of life that is not built around those sorts of things. But thinking about, you know, why does it occur? Well, economic historians will give you all sorts of answers about institutions and technological change. For a period of time, there was a geographic explanation. That one hasn't, you know, countries with particular geographic characteristics were the ones that grew. That explanation hasn't held up as well. But I'm going to go a little bit deeper, and I want to talk about, from our understanding of humans, from our understanding of our human nature, from our anthropology, are there any reasons why we shouldn't be surprised that this system works? And I just want to take up what, you know, we all know is two fundamental facts of our humanity. We're all made in the image of God, the imago Dei. I actually consider that to be one of the most revolutionary, mind-boggling things that you can think of in terms of political economy. The imago Dei, all people made in the image of God, just runs so counter to how most societies have been run. There's what sociologists call othering. You take people that are different than you and you other them. You think of them in terms of you know, that they are somehow different. And in fact, you can get a feel for this if you look at slavery. Throughout history, most people who have been willing to enslave other people had to find a difference. You know, very few people enslaved people that were exactly like them. It was racial, it was ethnicity, it was tribal, and so I think that, you know, unfortunately, slavery violates the imago Dei, but the way that it worked, the fact that it was difficult to think of enslaving a person exactly like you. So you drew some sorts of differences. And throughout history, one of the big sorts of things is we draw lines. And so the idea of people, all people, everywhere, every person you look at, however different that they are image bearers of God, that is dramatic. That is just this changes how you think about the people that you might dislike or the people that are different than you. So that fact is, you know, is one that I just think has an enormous implication. It takes a long time for it to work its way out into political institutions. You know, it clearly doesn't happen immediately, and clearly Christians haven't been completely consistent in terms of, you know, Christians have been slaveholders. Christians have done things that are pretty atrocious with regard to other human beings. But nevertheless, that's behind, you know, that is a fundamental part of the Jewish and the Christian tradition, and that is a pretty unique way to look at the world, you know, to see people in that sort of a way. And of course, the other thing we have to think about is we are made in the image of God, but we're fallen creatures. You know, we've fallen from a state of grace. So what all does that mean? I want to try to put this together with kind of what Jason and some of the others have talked about. So what does the imago Dei mean? It means several things. I think one thing it means that we're creative, we're ordering. God is a creative God. Our reflection of the image of God means that we're creating, we want to be creative. We actually like to create order out of chaos. You find things that don't fit together well, where there's chaotic things going on, and people want to create some sort of order. I think that's a reflection of the image of God. It means that we are personally responsible, or what I would call human agency is intrinsic to our nature as image bearers. The idea that we, made in the image of God, are responsible to God. So that needs to be a part of the image of God. And I would say that being part of the image of God generally means that there should be a domain of control for each of us that recognizes our personal agency and our human dignity. That's important to have the image of God in place. And so we need some sort of domain of control that gives us that sort of implication. What about the fall, though? Okay, so the image of God means we're creative, we're ordering, we want to go into places and do things that, in some sense, make the world a better place. But, of course, we sometimes find it hard to look much beyond ourselves. We are limited in terms of our world. Human finitude is a huge problem. I'm not sure that, I'm not enough of a theologian. I don't think that human finitude starts with the fall. I mean, in our original creation, I don't think we were omniscient, but it certainly is exacerbated by the fall. But we're limited in terms of how we can think about other people. And we think a lot about ourselves. We can behave in some, pretty inappropriate sorts of ways. We can be grasping and self-serving. So, what do I do with all of this? I think that an institutional ordering has to, or should, if it's going to be successful, needs to reflect both the image of God and restrictions. It needs to give people a certain domain of activity where they can act upon their creativity, where their human agency, their responsibility is recognized, but you have to have restrictions, okay? So then that takes me to market capitalism, and we've talked some about that. Market capitalism for me is just a system that defines opportunities for actions and limits on actions through well-defined and enforced property rights. Jason talked a little bit about property rights. A lot of these issues I'm willing to come back to in the question and answer period and give you, more about what do I mean by property rights. I include in property rights, and this, I don't know if this will be bothersome to you or not, I include in property rights the property right to yourself. I mean, self-ownership. And now self-ownership is an awkward term for us as Christians because we don't own ourselves. We are only stewards for God. But when I say the term self-ownership, it's in relative to other human control institutions. You own yourself compared to other people. You don't own yourself, relative to God, but you do have that. And so I'm including in that property rights. Some people draw a distinction between human rights and property rights. I don't draw that distinction. I'm putting them all together. All human rights are property rights. That's maybe a semantic sort of a thing. So in market capitalism, basically a lot of the incentives are for cooperation and information are options that are communicated through prices. Prices are a major communication network. Not nearly for everything. I would hope that a whole bunch of your world didn't use prices. When my children would be, one of them be told to clean up their beans, they could not offer to sell that opportunity or to buy that opportunity from a sibling. So there were certain sorts of things that ought not to be communicated through prices. But when we talk particularly about the impersonal world of exchange and specialization with people you don't know, there you depend a lot upon prices as a communication sort of a mechanism. So that's the market capitalism. I'm going to argue that market capitalism is a very interesting combination. It's fascinating because it has lots of opportunities, but it has lots of constraints. There's just lots of realms in which people are free to act. You can do lots of different sorts of things. We talk a lot about property rights as being kind of a right of freedom. You ever thought about property rights as a constraint? In a world of well-defined and enforced property rights, basically, there's all sorts of things I can't do. I cannot leave here and drive Bruce Howard's car without his permission. Why? That's a property rights regime. I can't enslave Seth. That's a property rights regime. There's just, property rights in one sense are opportunities, but in another very real sense, they're rules. You can't do this, can't do that. And particularly, they are a constraint upon the powerful. Because throughout history, the property right has been the right to take property from other people, or the opportunity to take right from other people, has been exercised by the politically elite, the economically elite, the socially elite. And so in some sense, well-defined and enforced property rights are an extreme constraint upon powerful people who historically have been able to use their power in all sorts of ways. So as I look at markets, my argument is that they put together in an interesting way, and I'm not going to argue in the necessarily completely unique way, but they put together these two aspects of our human nature, the imago Dei and the fall. They recognize both of those sorts of facts in the way that the rules operate. We have the freedom to act. Basically, it promotes voluntary cooperation. We are encouraged to cooperate with other people. That's a property rights regime says, can you find ways in which you can cooperate with people who may be quite different from you? I'm a carnivore and omnivore, big red meat eater. I've been a cattle rancher most of my life. One of the people in Bozeman, Montana, who has strong disagreements with me, works in a local shoe shop. He's a vegetarian. If he and I had to decide on our diets together, there would be a lot of conflict. We just disagree, and we disagree on several other lifestyle sorts of issues. As a typical Montana environmentalist, my guess is he would, I'm not sure he would know the term, but I think he's probably a pantheist. So we just have all sorts of disagreements. Can we find a way to cooperate? Yeah, I can take my cowboy boots in and he will put new soles on for $35, and we have a way of cooperation. So in some ways it says, okay, a lot of people out there that are different than you. Is there a way you can cooperate with them without getting into all sorts of battles with them? And it turns out that a system of well-defined and enforced property rights encourages people to look for the realms of cooperation and minimizes the points of conflict. Now, you still have to have agreement upon some of the very basic sorts of rules, namely, are all people image bearers? If you don't accept that rule, then or that precept, then you don't get very far. It does encourage entrepreneurial activity, and Jason talked a lot about technological change and the entrepreneurial activity that occurred in England, the power loom, weaving, all of those sorts of things, the steam engine. I think of some other interesting ones. Think about Eli Whitney in the 1790s. He's famous for the cotton gin. Actually, which may have been really unfortunate because it did make slavery more profitable. So that you could say, in some sense, he's to blame for slavery staying around as long as it did. But another interesting thing that he did was what we call, replaceable parts or interchangeable sorts of parts. Before Eli Whitney came along, when you manufactured something, you manufactured each individual item. In fact, he got a contract with the U.S. Armory to produce 100,000 rifles. And prior to his doing that, you would produce some of it en masse, but then each rifle was assembled individually, and you filed the lock, and you filed the trigger mechanism, and you put them all together. He made his rifles. He took them to the armory, and he took 100 of them, and he said, take them all apart. Took them all apart and put them in a pile in the middle of the room. And then he said, let's put them back together. And they just took the parts off of any different sorts of rifles and put them together. They were astounded. You can't do that. Each one has to be fit separately. Think about what the idea of interchangeable sorts of parts means to us. Now, I'm not much of a mechanic, but I've operated haying machinery on my farm for years, and I know that if I get the part number off of a bearing, and I go to the local farm store, and I give them that part number, and I take that bearing and I put it back on my baler, there's a 90.999% chance it is going to fit. And it's going to fit perfectly. And we do that with all sorts of things. You know, it's amazing what interchangeable parts means for modern technology. And so that's there's all sorts of entrepreneurial activities that occur about that. In the year 1806, a guy named Frederick Tudor decided that it might make sense to ship ice from New England to the southern part of the US and to the Caribbean. People thought it was a crazy idea. Ship ice? He actually, filled boats with ice, covered them with sawdust. By 1820, there were about 2,000 tons of ice being shipped all of the time. And by 1850, ice was one of the primary exports of New England. It's because he said people need ice. And then by 1900, it collapsed. We got refrigeration. So his business was out. And I think Jason has told you some about one of the things about this sort of entrepreneurial activity is, boy, it creates a lot of opportunities, and it also changes life and puts some people, at least in the short term, disadvantages them. So that's supposed to be one of the things that happens. The other thing, though, to remember about this freedom to act is it does allow people to express their own view of the good, the true, and the beautiful. It's not just about material well-being. It allows you to formulate your vision of the good life. And I think that's very important for the church. But it also means we need to be very, very intentional about what the good life is all about. And so one of the problems of the modern economy is we may have lost some of that vision, but it does let people have that sort of freedom to do that. The other sort of a thing is it allows for the expression of our social nature. People think about market capitalism as really being about individualism. I don't think that's a particularly good characterization of it. I think it's really about cooperation, about ways of dealing with other people. And that's important. We cooperate with other people in the marketplace, but we also cooperate with them in clubs, in communities, in the church, in the Little League, in Boy Scouts, and Girl Scouts, all of those sorts of things. We are social creatures. God created us as social creatures. And so we need to have ways to express that. And this sort of a system allows particular expressions of that. If we don't have those particular rights in place, then we can get some terrible sorts of things that can happen. I should talk a little bit more about property rights. They do provide incentives for what we would call positive sum activity. Property rights are rules about what you can do, and they are behind the entrepreneurial activity that we economic historians keep talking about. You are encouraged to take actions that would advantage other sorts of people, and so it's a positive incentive, but as I said before, a property right is also a constraint on freedom to act. You can't do a lot of things because of property rights. There are rules that say you can do stuff, but you can't do this one over here. You can't touch that over there unless you get the voluntary consent of the property right owner. So they are, they're a constraint, a very interesting constraint. And so don't think of property rights just as freedom. Think about them about you can't do rules. You can't do this, you can't do that. And they turn out to be important. And in fact, I would say that they are also a very important component of what we would think of as a just society. And that particularly goes back to the image of God. If we even think, we can think about, earlier history, throughout history, remember slavery has been a system throughout almost all of history. And the real question is not why slavery, but why did slavery end? That's the fascinating sort of an issue. After several thousand years, why did slavery end? And I would argue it's the Christian argument of the image of God. William Wilberforce, other people that just kept saying, these are people made in the image of God. How can you own other people? And it took that. I would say that the natural distinction to see people as others is so powerful that it takes a metaphysical concept to overcome that. I don't think you can do it with just kind of an economic, political concept. It takes a metaphysical idea in order to overcome that natural, I would say, part of the, or maybe part of the fallen nature. But we could even look at the 20th century, and we could look at some of the great historical injustices. They're basically violations of property rights. You know, they are, particularly if you think of property rights as, you know, ownership of yourself. You know, all of these are property rights violations. You know, the Holocaust, Stalin's purges cost somewhere between 20 and 30 million. Mao's Great Leap Forward and his Cultural Revolution, the estimates vary between 50 and 70 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. You can look at Cambodia, about 3 million out of 5 million people in Cambodia were killed, or you could even look at the Rwanda genocide, you know, all of that. Or if you want something more recent, some of you may have read Gary Haugen's most recent book, The Locust Effect. He's with International Justice Mission. Very disturbing, but very powerful book, as he talks about how the dispossessed in much of the world just don't have access to the basic tenets of justice. The sex trade, people that are in slavery. There are 30 million slaves in India. It's an amazing statistic, and have lived there, their whole families, for years and years. People, you know, oftentimes in many of the countries, there's a crime, and the police need to do something about solving the crime. What do? They pick up a poor person, a person who doesn't have much power, they throw them in jail. There's not due process. They may stay in jail for 3 or 4 years, you know, before they ever get out. And so that's just all sorts of injustices that basically, I would say, violate the image of God. So here's my basic argument. A reason, maybe the reason, for the success of modern market systems is that they are a fit with our human nature. They complement, or they go with, in a very interesting sort of way, the fact that we are image bearers and that we are fallen. So as I look at the 20th century, I would say market capitalism, in a sense, did well because it reflected who we are. Now, I've got to be a little careful here. I am not arguing that this is the biblical system. I don't think you can go to the Old Testament and find all of the conditions for the corporation that Steve talked about, or any of those sorts of things. This is not the biblically, I'm not arguing that you go to the Bible and you find all of the aspects of market capitalism. In fact, there may be other systems that would also reflect the image of God and you know, our fallen nature. So it's a fit. It's not a perfect fit. And so there may be all sorts of problems with it. And one of the things we have to do is to examine it and figure out where we've not taken appropriate cognizance of the fall, or are appropriately aware of allowing for the image of God to be expressed. But it is, as you think about the modern market system, it is a very fascinating system of opportunity and constraint. It's a quite amazing way of putting that together. And I would argue that explains its success in terms of both justice considerations, but there's times when it's unjust, when it hasn't done a particularly good job, and in terms of material well-being. Okay, is it all that good? And I'm sure some of these concerns have been raised before. But what about the market system? Does it always work? Well, there is one other big issue is, can we maintain, a market system depends heavily upon trust. You think about all of your economic transactions that are trust-based, and it requires a moral people. And so Seth was raising the question about, you know, modern secularization. Do markets produce, or do they continue to add to our social capital, or do they deplete our social capital? I don't think they automatically deplete our social capital, but I think if we're not cautious, they can. And so the idea of public virtue, a common moral understanding of right and wrong, about what it contributes to human flourishing, those are issues that we have to face. Another issue, and one of you was raising this in the session before, some people are left out. Works for a lot of people, but you've got people in your congregation who it's not working very well for. You know, they're struggling, they're unemployed, they've got all sorts of difficulties. And so we have to think about those sorts of issues. And then the last one that I would raise, and this goes somewhat with the secularism sort of an argument, do markets just kind of feed our hedonism? Do they make us too materialistic? Again, I don't think that they have to. I think there's some evidence that it doesn't always happen that sort of a way, but it is clearly an issue. So let's take each of those up. I'll be very brief about them and come back and talk more about them if you want to. The public virtue one is you just have to have some sort of a common moral understanding for market orders to work well. And you have to have a way of evaluating price signals. Price signals are very, very important. They tell you all sorts of things. But you've got to think about, what does it mean? Interesting case in point. Pornography has become extremely cheap, almost zero price. That's a price signal. How should we react to that price signal? We ought not to react to that price signal by saying, boy, this is a very cheap commodity. I will consume lots of it. That is one of the things that that's one of the things that ordinarily prices communicate to us is as goods get cheaper, you consume more of them. You know, as particular food items become cheaper, you substitute them for more expensive sorts of items. We cannot look at the world of prices independent of a moral framework. We have to have a way of thinking about what's behind that. What's the commodity that's being bought or sold? What does it imply for the good of our soul? What does it imply for the good of people that are around us? And so that is just one of the sorts of things that in order for a successful market order to sustain itself is a moral framework. What about the inequality sort of an issue? There is no question that we have had rising inequality in the United States. From 1979 to 2010, or we go up to the more recent data, it is clear that the rich have gotten richer faster than the poor have gotten richer. This is a big issue right now in a book by a French economist, Thomas Piketty, and causing lots of interest and controversy in the economics profession and even beyond the economics profession. And whenever a book like that captures attention beyond the profession, you know that it has a lot going on. And he's concerned about the whole issue of rising inequality over time. As I look at the data, however, and some people would disagree with that, but as I look at the data, everybody got better. Not every individual, but you look at all of the income groups, and they all increased. If we divide the whole population into what we call quintiles, the bottom 20%, the next 20%, 20% on up to the top, all of them got richer during this period of time. Average was about 50%, but the people at the top were the ones who really, they got a lot of that increase in wealth. Is that a moral problem? It could well be. I want to argue, though, that inequality measures are really a poor proxy for what we should care about. And what we should care about are the people at the bottom who aren't doing well, that are disenfranchised, that have lost their jobs. And if you just look at inequality, that doesn't get at that figure. You know, it may be an approximation for it, but I think we as Christians are held responsible to do something about the people that are hurting. Inequality may or may not tell you anything about that. You go back to the year 1800 and the world was quite equal. There were some parts of the world per capita income in the wealthiest countries of the world was about 3 times per capita income of the people in the poorest part of the world. Now it's, depending on your measures, 20 times, 50 times. We are a much more unequal world. Now, if you just take equality as your measure, you'd say, well, I guess 1800 was a better sort of a world. Or think of it in the following sort of a way. Assume that a member of your congregation goes to college, hopefully Wheaton College, goes on to medical school, and comes up with a way to deliver low-cost health care to African villages. And she's very, very competent at it. And every year she goes to Africa, and 100 villages get dramatic increases in their health care. It's become a more unequal world. It would be nice if health care were delivered everywhere, to everybody, all at the same time. But the way that she's working, 100 villages get better off. But there's thousands of villages that are still where they were. If we look at health care, we'd say, boy, it's become unequal. We should care about the people that are hurting. And so the inequality measure has all sorts of difficulties with it. One of the difficulties with it is that it is a static measure. There's a lot of mobility in and out. And if you look at a movement in and out of those particular income categories, there's a tremendous amount of movement over 10 years out of each of those income categories by the quintiles. It's very interesting. People, even at the top, that people are there for a period of time and then they fall. And then other people take their place. So what bothers me, there's a lot of mobility. Mobility is not as great as it is in some other countries, despite the fact that we might claim that it is. But there's still a fair amount of income mobility. Part of it's just life cycle. People start out in their first job, or they're in college and their incomes are low. Their incomes are much higher than by their middle income earning years, and then I've now entered the low income part of my life, and that I'm living off my Social Security. Thanks to you folks, you're going to continue to pay it for me. I'm not sure that you'll get yours, but I'm getting mine. So there's that problem. But the data on the income mobility thing that I find most bothersome is lots of mobility, except for the bottom 20%. Half of the bottom 20% don't move over a 10-year span. Those are the people we really need to be thinking about. They're the people that are oftentimes locked in poverty. They're the ones who do not have great opportunities. And so it's not so much the income inequality measure as it is that people are hurting. And in some sense, you could say the income inequality captures that. But I would go more directly just to looking at how people hurt. The other sort of a thing I would look at is, what about the wealthy people? Steve Jobs, before he passed away, his annual earnings were about $130 million. His wealth was about $6.7 billion. Look at J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author. Her wealth is about $1 billion. At one point it was about $3 billion. She's given a lot of it away. Or look at, say, Bill Gates. His wealth is $72 billion. One of the implications of the great concern for income inequality is, if only these people weren't around, we'd have their wealth. If they weren't there, the money would go to the middle class, or it would go to the poor people. Not necessarily. These are people. Now, maybe we would prefer a world where the wealth doesn't get concentrated on particular entrepreneurs, but it is the way the world works. And so the question is, how should we look at their wealth? One of the things, you could look at Steve Jobs and his wealth. You can go buy an 11 MacBook Air. It's going to go to his estate, not to Steve now. But you can buy a MacBook Air with limited capacity for $900. When you are buying that MacBook Air, what kind of a statement are you making? You're making a statement, I'm becoming wealthier. You wouldn't pay the $899 unless you were getting more than $899 worth of value out of it. So every MacBook Air that is sold, unless somebody makes a gross mistake, has created for the consumer more than $900 worth of wealth. Now, I know that Apple gets the $900, but remember the other side of the equation. Every purchase is a statement by somebody, I just got wealthier. They wouldn't have bought it if they wouldn't have gotten wealthier. So we might be upset that Jobs gets a lot of money, but hey, how did he get it? In a system of voluntary exchange, you only get it by offering people something that they think is worthwhile. You can look at J.K. Rowling's wealth. I looked up on Amazon before I came, her first book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. You can buy it for $6.59. When you buy it, what are you doing? You're saying, I like this. Now you might read the book and change your mind. Most people that have read it said, I would have paid more. And so we make mistakes. Not all purchases turn out to be good for us. But generally, Rowling became wealthy because she created wealth for other people. So we have to be careful when we look at the income inequality data and say, oh, that's awful. These people got all this money. We also have to look at it and say, well, I guess they did something that helped other people out. Bill Gates' wealth, $72 billion. You can get the kind of mid version, the Microsoft Office, it's called the home and professional version, for $219.99. If you buy that, you're making a statement about, I'm going to do better off. And it also turns out that Microsoft Office is benefiting you even if you're not a purchaser. If you're in the hospital, it's probably scheduling the nurse's rotation. If you are in a parts house, if you're buying a repair part from an automobile repair place, Microsoft Office is probably being used to make those inventories work better. So so you're getting wealth not only from your purchase, but from lots of other sorts of people. So generally, you look at the wealth, and it doesn't necessarily mean that if people weren't around, we would all be better off. Now, there is an important caveat here, and that is there is something that I call taking versus making. And some wealth inequality is not the result of making, it's the result of taking. And so when that happens, and by the way, the interesting thing about the institutional revolution or the change in the world that Jason and I think a lot about is we moved from a world where the way to get wealth was to take to a world where, at least for a portion of the population, the way to get wealthy was to make. But we still have to think about the fact that it's possible to become wealthy by taking rather than making. And in many countries, and to some extent in the US, people get wealthy by taking their wealth rather than making it. And sometimes it's not a direct taking, sometimes it's just getting a particular privilege, getting a restriction on opportunity. Sometimes it's just actual taking. Mugabe in Zimbabwe just takes a lot of wealth. He's very, very wealthy. But you can take an individual like actually one of the wealthiest people in the world is Carlos Slim in Mexico. Carlos Slim has accumulated a lot of wealth. He's done it through media outlets, through ownership of energy companies, but a huge amount of his wealth comes from the fact that he gets official restrictions on competition from the government. That I would call more of a taking than a making. So that's a very real sort of an issue, and it's actually an issue in the US. And when I talk about the US and the fact that, the inequality, I would say that crony capitalism is a danger. There is a very real possibility that we enter into a world of taking. And so I think that some of the problems started back our present problems started in 1984 when we bailed out continental Illinois. There was the Mexican bailout in 1995. That's always interesting to me. That was in the Mexican peso crisis. And so the question was, should the US bail out Mexico? The US said, yes, we will bail out Mexico. Do you know who they bailed out? The Western banks, the US banks who had made loans to Mexico and were going to go under. So you could call it a Mexican bailout, but it was a bailout of banks who'd made bad loans. Long-term capital management in 1998. Now that wasn't an official government payment, but there was a forced acquisition of long-term capital management by other sorts of firms. And then I regard much of what happened in 2008, 2009 as kind of crony capitalism. Now there is the issue, and an important one, and I would certainly defer to some of the other economists here. Were we in such a situation that basically it's necessary to bail out firms to keep the whole economy from collapsing? Are there too big to fail firms? And that could well be. I guess my answer would be if they're too big to fail, then maybe they're too big. But there's something, you can talk about kind of the macroeconomic aspects of it, but I would, there's something that kind of flies in the face of our moral understanding, in the sense that a hardware store owner in DeKalb, Illinois in 2008 discovers that his liabilities are greater than his assets, and he declares bankruptcy, and he goes under. A major financial firm runs into problems. They don't go under, or they get absorbed, or the taxpayer money is used to bail them out. And that just seems to me that does not fit with what I would call a moral understanding of the world. Okay, well that's the inequality issue, but I want to take one more look at that one. Another huge contributor to the inequality issue is change in family structure, and it's really a lack of marriage formation. That is just, there's no way of getting around the data there, that has had a huge effect. This is the rise in out-of-wedlock childbearing in the United States. Excuse me.
Go back one slide. I missed your second point.
Could you go back one slide?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, thanks.
This one?
No, the change in family structure.
Okay.
Equality,
Okay, we'll go.
family structure, and one other.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, comments, or do you want to, or just, okay, sorry to flip through that so quickly. But that has had both a statistical effect in that the households are very different. We're now talking about lots more households than what we used to. So you just look at income, that has a big effect. But it also has an effect on basically what we think of as the ability to prepare people for the marketplace, also effect on how we communicate our moral memory. It's mostly done through the family. You may not be able to read the dates along the bottom, but they start in 1930. They're pretty constant up to about 1960. Somewhere between 4 and 6% of children are born into single-parent families. Then we get the sexual revolution. And now that data says 40.8%. I think it's now about 43% of children in the United States are born into single-parent families. That just has all sorts of implications, I think, for maintaining what we would call civic virtue. It has a lot of effects on the economic structure. It is interesting if you look at the percentage of families with children that are poor. Over a third of single-parent families, female-headed families, are below the poverty line. Only 6.8% of married two-parent families are below the poverty line. Now, you got to be careful not to go around blaming the women for this. You don't know who's really at fault. I think it's largely the men who are not committing to long-term marriages. I was just listening to a recent podcast that says the typical way of relationships now is young couple meet, they decide to date, they decide to start living together. After 4 to 5 months, the woman stops taking birth control pills. That's her statement of commitment to the relationship. A few months later, they have a child, and somewhere between 0 and 5 years of age on that child, the man is out of the household. He's gone. And so that, it's a male problem as much as it is a female problem. It is the case that less educated women are more likely to give birth out of marriage. If you're a high school dropout, almost 2/3 of the children born to high school dropouts are out of wedlock. Now again, you got to be a little careful about correlation and causation. Which way is it going here? Oops, maybe I'll go back. I didn't. The high school graduate. It's the red line tells you the percentage that are born outside of marriage. The interesting thing is, again, for college graduates, only 8% of the children are born outside of marriage. And one of the problems is, and a lot of this comes from a book by Charles Murray, The Coming Apart of White America. He just looks at Caucasian America, and he thinks we're dividing into two particular groups. Groups who have a script of go to school, get married, have children, get a job, keep a job, and another group of people with very low labor force participation rates, very high rates of children born out of wedlock, and interestingly enough, much less involvement. You just look at the number of them that are involved in what we would call organizations, and it's much smaller. There's much less commitment to community. So there's just all sorts of things that are, I think, are quite troubling, in that we may be moving to, we've never been a class-free society, but we've been reasonable about mobility. I think it's going to be harder and harder to maintain that sort of mobility. Again, this is the same sort of a thing. Poor families with children are not married, so that's the same sort of data. I mean, I can give you a lot more of that data, or I can give you sources on it. But I want to stop with the last one, the materialism or hedonism one. And in some sense, Seth got at that, in that the wealth-producing capabilities of a market system they're good, but they can alter our moral sensibilities. They can alter them for the better. One of the things about participating in markets is you can develop a sense of mutual gain. You understand that you are in this because other people are gaining from what you do. So markets don't necessarily destroy our moral understanding of the world, but they certainly can. And one of the places that I would go to get a feel for this is when the Israelites are about to go into the Promised Land, and Moses is telling them, God is speaking through Moses, about what's going to happen when they go into the Promised Land. So he recapitulates, the 40 years in the wilderness, everything that goes on there. He tells them that their clothing didn't wear out, their feet did not swell for those 40 years. But he says, look what I'm going to do for you. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, etc., etc. A land where stones are iron, and out of hills you can dig copper, and you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good hand he's given you. Now, I may be reading too much into modern economy, but in some sense, we have been brought into the Promised Land by virtue of production of goods and services. And I think the warning that God gives to the people of Israel as they go in is a very real one for us. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God. Here's the problem. When you've eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is left multiplied, then your heart will be lifted up and you will forget the Lord your God. You may say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. Okay? What's one of the real problems of material success? Pride. Feeling like we did it ourselves. This feeling of individual autonomy. Failure to recognize the fact that God gives us blessings. So, that's my take. Since Jason gave my economic growth talk, I had to find something else to do, so I decided to talk about what I think is behind economic growth. And again, as I look at the world, it seems to me oftentimes coordination systems, or what we would call political economic systems, err on one side in that they don't recognize the image of God enough in people, and on the other side, they recognize the image of God enough in people, and they or they err on the other side. They assume people are perfectible and they don't think enough about the fall. And so throughout history, systems have struggled to get the right sort of balance. This is not a defense that says we have found the perfect balance. This is not a defense that says this is it. But as I look historically about kind of who we are as humans, I would say a fundamental reason for the economic growth and a system that meets reasonable standards of justice, doesn't always do that, but has met reasonable standards of justice, is this fascinating combination of freedom and constraint. And you've got to have both. Have we got it perfectly? No. Have we got a system like that? Yes. So, I'll stop there.